Hello, book lovers. Welcome to the second session of the guided readings of Charlotte Bronte's novel, The Professor. So, we are continuing our journey reading this novel, which was the first written by Charlotte Brontë, but the last to be published. It was published posthumously 2 years after her death in 1857. So, how are you today? Are you ready and excited to continue reading this novel with me? Last time I introduced you to the novel, we read the preface and chapter 1, and today we're going to read chapters 2, 3, and 4. Um, Yes, so guided reading of The Professor. This is part of our literary cycle about Charlotte Brontë at Books and Culture. So we're doing the guided reading sessions of The Professor. And there is also the online course Exploring Jane Eyre, a journey into Victorian literature. This upcoming online course in which we'll talk about Charlotte Bronte's masterpiece, Jane Eyre. Hello. I see Sofiane is here. Hi, everyone. Great to have you here live. And as I was saying, we're going to explore and read and really dig into Jane Eyre in this online course that starts on the 26th of February. Just for you to have an idea of what we'll do. So each class starts with a mini lecture from me. So I introduce you to the class's topic. There is contextual information, critical information about the novel. I'm going to talk to you about Victorian culture, literature, and society. We'll talk about Charlotte Bronte's childhood, her period as a teacher in Brussels. We'll talk about the liminal role of the governess in Victorian culture, this social position that was in between the working class and the upper class, a role that was also taken by Charlotte Brontë herself, in addition to the character Jane Eyre. There's a lot of autobiographical things in Jane Eyre. No wonder the full title is Jane Eyre, an Autobiography. That's also something we'll talk about. We'll talk about the symbols of the color red and fire and hell that are very predominant in Jane Eyre. We'll talk about Gothic elements and about a woman's journey into self-fulfillment. So these are just some of the topics that we'll talk about in this course. So if you haven't joined yet, go to the website booksandculture.club to sign up for the course, Exploring Jane Eyre, A Journey into Victorian Literature. This is a live course, so it will happen on 4 Mondays at 5 p.m. Central European Time via Zoom. So we'll get together in this virtual classroom. But if you cannot join live, the sessions will be recorded so you can watch them later. 4 lessons. And this will be the only time that this course will be offered, the only time that we'll study Jane Eyre together. So don't miss this chance. And there are limited spots, so then we can create this cozy atmosphere to discuss this novel. All right, so let's turn our attention to The Professor. If you saw the first session, you've read with me then the preface and chapter 1. Let me know what you think of The Professor so far. And today we're going to continue with chapters 2, 3, and 4. So what have we seen so far about this novel? So the protagonist, the professor of the title, is William Crimsworth. So he is the protagonist, the one we read the story. We read the story through his perspective, and what we know from chapter 1, we get to know him and his life history. So his father was in trade, but he went bankrupt. And his mother was from a higher rank, um, and she married probably out of love because it was not considered a good association marrying someone from the trade business. Um, but as the father went bankrupt after his death, the mother lived in destitution. She was abandoned by her own family since she had married not according to their own standards. So her brothers, who are William's uncles, completely abandoned their sister, and William's mother ended up dying in destitution and isolation. Um, and that really pained Edward. Edward is William's brother. Edward is also in trade and he's very successful in this profession. Um, and he's older, I believe around 10 years older than William. And he completely cut relationships with William because William kept in contact and in the favor of his maternal uncles that had abandoned their mother. We learn in chapter 1 that William decides to cut all links with his maternal uncles, and tries to mend his relationship with his brother. So now, as he has no fortune, no prospects, he's had a good education because his maternal uncles paid for it. So he went to had an education at Eton, and now he has no prospects. He doesn't know what to do with his life. So he decides to go to where his brother is and he decides to try life as a tradesman. And this is where we left off. This is what we're going to continue today. So let's take a look at chapter 2. A fine October morning succeeded to the foggy evening that had witnessed my first introduction to Crimsworth Hall. And Crimsworth Hall is the residence of his brother Edward. I was early up and walking in the large park-like meadow surrounding the house. The autumn sun, rising over the Shire hills, disclosed a pleasant country. Woods brown and mellow varied the fields from which the harvest had been lately carried. A river gliding between the woods caught on its surface the somewhat cold gleam of the October sun and sky. At frequent intervals along the banks of the river, tall cylindrical chimneys, almost like slender round towers, indicated the factories which the trees have concealed. Here and there mansions, similar to Crimsworth Hall, occupied agreeable sites on the hillside. The country wore on the whole a cheerful, active, fertile look. Steam, trade, machinery had long banished from it all romance and seclusion. At a distance of 5 miles, a valley opening between the low hills held in its cups the great town of X. She does not give any names of location, right? So she uses X. A dense, permanent vapor brooded over this locality. There lay Edward's concern. So the landscape here is very significant, right? So nature is beautiful, right? He pays attention to the autumn sun, the hills, the woods, the pleasant country. But all of this landscape has been marred by the advance of technology, the advance of so-called progress, the advance of machinery. So there are chimneys. Chimneys take over the landscape, almost like slender round towers, indicating the factories which the trees have concealed. And look at the words that the author, Charlotte Brontë, uses to refer to this area. Steam, trade, machinery, banished from it all romance and seclusion. So so we're not in the late 18th century anymore. We're definitely in the 19th century when the Industrial Revolution really changed the urban, Yes, the urban, sorry, the rural landscape and the urban as well. But we're talking here about the countryside, how the arrival of the railways, the factories, the chimneys, the pollution, how that changed the way people lived in the countryside. Okay, I forced my eye to scrutinize this prospect. I forced my mind to dwell on it for a time, and when I found that it communicated no pleasurable emotion to my heart, that it stirred in me none of the hopes a man ought to feel when he sees laid before him the scene of his life's career, I said to myself, William, you are a rebel against circumstances. You are a fool, and know not what you want. You have chosen trade, and you shall be a tradesman. Look, I continued mentally, look at the sooty smoke in the hollow, and know that there is your post. There you cannot dream, you cannot speculate and theorize. There you shall out and work. It's a narrative in the first person. So we read it all through William's perspective. And he's not excited by this new phase in his life. He does not feel excited about the landscape, but he thinks, I have made this decision, I will go through with it. So I have chosen to be a tradesman, I will be a tradesman. And in this place where work is hard, it's all about factories and machinery, there is no place for dreaming, speculating, or theorizing. All right. Thus self-schooled, I returned to the house. My brother was in the breakfast room. I met him collectedly. I could not meet him cheerfully. He was standing on the rug, his back to the fire. How much did I read in the expression of his eye as my glance encountered his? When I advanced to bid him good morning, how much that was contradictory to my nature. He said, Good morning, abruptly and nodded, and then he snatched, rather than took, a newspaper from the table and began to read it with the air of a master who seizes a pretext to escape the bore of conversing with an underling. So they don't have a brother-sibling relationship, right? It's clear that Edward is the master, or so he wanted to be, and that William is supposed to be his inferior, not his equal. Mm. It was well I had taken a resolution to endure for a time, or his manner would have gone far to render insupportable the disgust I had just been endeavoring to subdue. I looked at him. I measured his robust frame and powerful proportions. I saw my own reflection in the mirror over the mantelpiece. I amused myself with comparing the two pictures. In face, I resembled him, though I was not so handsome. My features were less regular. I had a darker eye and a broader brow. In form, I was greatly inferior. Thinner, slighter, not so tall. As an animal, Edward excelled me far. Should he prove as paramount in mind as in person, I must be a slave. For I must expect from him no lion-like generosity to one weaker than himself. His cold, avaricious eye, his stern, forbidding manner told me he would not spare. Had I then force of mind to cope with him? I did not know. I had never been tried. Mrs. Crimsworth's entrance diverted my thoughts for a moment. She looked well, dressed in white, her face and her attire shining in morning and bridal freshness. I addressed her with the degree of ease her last night's careless gaiety seemed to warrant, but she replied with coolness and restraint. Her husband had tutored her. She was not to be too familiar with his clerk. So the atmosphere has changed, right? She had been so friendly the previous night because she thought she was meeting Edward's family, but probably her husband rectified the situation. He's not to be treated as family, he's to be treated as a servant. As soon as breakfast was over, Mr. Crimsworth intimated to me that they were bringing the gig round to the door, and that in 5 minutes he should expect me to be ready to go down with him to X, the name of the city. I did not keep him waiting. We were soon dashing at a rapid rate along the road. The horse he drove was the same vicious animal about which Mrs. Crimsworth had expressed her fears the night before. Once or twice Jack seemed disposed to turn restive, but a vigorous and determined application of the whip from the ruthless hand of his master soon compelled him to submission, and Edward's dilated nostril expressed his triumph in the result of the contest. He scarcely spoke to me during the whole of the brief drive, only opening his lips at intervals to damn his horse. And we can compare here William with the horse, which is being whipped into submission. That's what Edward plans to do with William. X was all stir and bustle when we entered it. We left the clean streets where there were dwelling houses and shops, churches and public buildings. We left all these and turned down to a region of mills and warehouses. So, working urban area. Thence we passed through the two massive gates into a great paved yard, and we were in Big Ben close, and the mill was before us, vomiting soot from its long chimney, and quivering through its thick brick walls with the commotion of its iron bowels. And I love this image. Look at it. The mill was vomiting soot from its long chimney. It's not a favorable depiction, quite the opposite. Can you imagine that mental picture? So the chimney's vomiting pollution and quivering through its thick brick walls with the commotion of its iron bowels. So as if an organic entity, kind of like a monster taking over, right? It's a very, very negative and disturbing image, right? Work people were passing to and fro. A wagon was being laden with pieces. Mr. Grimsworth looked from side to side and seemed at one glance to comprehend all that was going on. He alighted, and leaving his horse and gig to the care of a man who hastened to take the reins from his hand, he bid me follow him to the counting house. We entered it, a very different place from the parlors of Grimsworth Hall, a place for business, with a bare plunked floor, a safe, two high desks and stools, and some chairs. Very plain, no luxury like his home residence. This is a place for business, so no distractions, no random expenditure of money. This is a place for business, bare, right? A person was seated at one of the desks who took off his square cap when Mr. Grimsworth entered, and in an instant was again absorbed in his occupation of writing or calculating, I know not which. Mr. Grimsworth, having removed his mackintosh, sat down by the fire. I remained standing near the hearth. He said presently, "Steighton, you may leave the room. I have some business to transact with these gentlemen. Come back when you hear the bell." So he refers to William as this gentleman, not as my brother, right? So I see in the comments that Michelle writes, her word choice describing the mill reminds me a lot of the wording you would use to describe an ill person. Yes, and progress is an illness. It's sickness, right? That that contaminates and kills the romantic scenery, that kills nature. It's quite negative perspective of progress, and that is through William's eyes. I'm sure that if it had been described by Edward Grimsworth, the vocabulary would have been very different, right? Because that's something he's passionate about, and on the other hand, that's something that William abhors. The individual at the desk rose and departed, closing the door as he went out. Mr. Grimsworth stirred the fire, then folded his arms and sat a moment thinking, his lips compressed, his brow knit. I had nothing to do but to watch him. How well his features were cut! What a handsome man he was! Whence then came that air of contraction, that narrow and hard aspect of his forehead in all his lineaments? Look how Edward is depicted. Think of a face that is contracted, narrow, hard, not friendly at all, right? Turning to me, he began abruptly. You are come down to Shire to learn to be a tradesman. Yes, I am. Have you made up your mind on the point? Let me know that at once. Yes. Well, I am not bound to help you, but I have a place here vacant if you are qualified for it. I will take you on trial. What can you do? Do you know anything besides that useless trash of college learning, Greek, Latin, and so forth? So again, this distinction between practical knowledge. What what kind of knowledge is really necessary to get on with business, to get on with practical things in the world? That would not be Greek, Latin, and so forth, what he learned at school, but that would allow him to have other occupations in life that he finds more to his taste. So, what did he say before? Theorizing, dreaming, reading, right? That's what he's passionate about. But he cannot use that kind of knowledge in the, let's say, real world. He says, I have studied mathematics. Stuff, I dare say you have. I can read and write French and German. Hmm. He reflected a moment, then opening a drawer in a desk near him, took out a letter and gave it to me. Can you read that? He asked. It was a German commercial letter. I translated it. I could not tell whether he was gratified or not. His countenance remained fixed. It is well, he said after a pause, that you are acquainted with something useful, something that may enable you to earn your board and lodging. Since you know French and German, I will take you as second clerk to manage the foreign correspondence of the house. I shall give you a good salary, £90 a year. And now, he continued, raising his voice, hear once for all what I have to say about our relationship and all that sort of humbug. I must have no nonsense on that point. It would never suit me. I shall excuse you nothing on the plea of being my brother. If I find you stupid, negligent, dissipated, idle, or possessed of any faults detrimental to the interests of the house, I shall dismiss you as I would any other clerk. £90 a year are good wages, and I expect to have the full value of my money out of you. Remember, too, that things are on a practical footing in my establishment. Business-like habits, feelings, and ideas suit me best. Do you understand? Partly, I replied. I suppose you mean that I am to do my work for my wages, not to expect favor from you, and not to depend on you for any help but what I earn. That suits me exactly, and on these terms I will consent to be your clerk. Yes, Sofiani says, it looks like an interview job. Yes, so he's making sure, Edward is making sure that William knows he's being treated just like any other any other of his employees, right? Just like any other clerk. He's not going to get any special treatment from being his brother. Quite the contrary, as we'll see. I turned on my heel and walked to the window. This time I did not consult his face. This time I did not consult his face to, where is it? Oh, yeah. This time I did not consult his face to learn his opinion. What it was, I do not know, nor did I then care. After a silence of some minutes, he recommenced. You perhaps expect to be accommodated with apartments at Grimsworth Hall and to go and come with me in the gig. It's like carriage. I wish you, however, to be aware that such an arrangement would be quite inconvenient to me. I like to have the seat in my gig at liberty for any gentleman whom, for business reasons, I may wish to take down to the hall for a night or so. You will seek out lodgings in X. So, in addition to not being treated in any special way, he will not stay in his house and he will not come with him to work. Quitting the window, I walked back to the hearth. Of course I shall seek out lodgings in X, I answered. It would not suit me either to lodge at Grimsworth Hall. My tone was quiet. I always speak quietly. Yet Mr. Grimsworth's blue eyes became incensed. He took his revenge rather oddly. Turning to me, he said bluntly, You are poor enough, I suppose. How do you expect to live till your quarter salary becomes due? I shall get on, said I. How do you expect to live? He repeated in a louder voice. As I can, Mr. Grimsworth. Getting to debt at your peril, that's all, he answered. For what I know, you may have extravagant aristocratic habits. If you have, drop them. I tolerate nothing of the sort here, and I will never give you a shilling extra, whatever liabilities you may incur. Mind that. Yes, Mr. Grimsworth, you will find I have a good memory. I said no more. I did not think the time was come for much parley. I had an instinctive feeling that it would be folly to let one's temper effervesce often with such a man as Edward. I said to myself, I will place my cup under this continual dropping. It shall stand there still and steady. When full, it will run over of itself. Meantime, patience. Two things are certain. I am capable of performing the work Mr. Crimsworth has set me. I can earn my wages conscientiously, and those wages are sufficient to enable me to live. As to the fact of my brother assuming towards me the bearing of a proud, harsh master, the fault is his, not mine. And shall his injustice, his bad feeling, turn me at once aside from the path I have chosen? No. At least, ere I deviate, I will advance far enough to see whither my career tends. As yet, I am only pressing in at the entrance. A straight gate enough. It ought to have a good terminus. While I thus reasoned, Mr. Crimsworth rang a bell. His first clerk, the individual dismissed previously to our conference, re-entered. Mr. Staton, said he, show Mr. William the letters from Voss Brothers, and give him English copies of the answers. He will translate them. Mr. Staton, a man of about 35, with a face at once sly and heavy, hastened to execute this order. He laid the letters on the desk, and I was soon seated at it, and engaged in rendering the English answers into German. A sentiment of keen pleasure accompanied this first effort to earn my own living. So he's proud that he's doing something he's not passionate about, but he's proud that by doing that, he's going to earn his living for the first time in his life. A sentiment neither poisoned nor weakened by the presence of the taskmaster, who stood and watched me for some time as I wrote. I thought he was trying to read my character, but I felt as secure against his scrutiny as if I had had on a casque with the visor down. Or rather, I showed him my countenance with the confidence that one would show an unlearned man a letter written in Greek. He might see lines and trace characters, but he could make nothing of them. My nature was not his nature, and its signs were to him like the words of an unknown tongue. Ere long he turned away abruptly, as if baffled, and left the counting-house. He returned to it but twice in the course of that day. Each time he mixed and swallowed a glass of brandy and water, the materials for making which he extracted from a cupboard on one side of the fireplace. Having glanced at my translations, he could read both French and German. He went out again in silence. And this is the end of chapter 2. So, what do you think? What do you think will happen to William? He's certainly not happy with this decision, but he wants to be an independent man, right? So he cut off all ties to his maternal uncles who had treated his mother so badly to go on through life on his own. And that's something we talked about last time that Charlotte Brontë herself wrote here in the preface. She wrote, I said to myself that my hero should work his way through life as I had seen real living men work theirs, that he should never get a shilling he had not earned, that no sudden turn should lift him in a moment to wealth and high station, that whatever small competency he might gain should be won by the sweat of his brow, that before he could find so much as an arbor to sit down in, he should master at least half the ascent of the hill of difficulty, that he should not even marry a beautiful girl or a lady of rank. As Adam's son, he should share Adam's doom and drain throughout life a mixed and moderate cup of enjoyment. And this is really what she does when she creates William Crimsworth. It is a man who will go through life without any romantic help, let's say. Romantic, and I mean from the romantic period, from the Romanticism. So when things worked well for the protagonist. This is real life. So this is realist fiction. And you see that it may not please all readers, but this is what she wanted, and this is what we see, right? So it's going to be a tough journey for William Crimsworth. So let's see how he goes on in this trade world in chapter 3. I served Edward as his second clerk faithfully, punctually, diligently. What was given me to do, I had the power and the determination to do well. Mr. Crimsworth watched sharply for defects, but found none. He set Timothy Straighton, his favorite and head man, to watch also. Tim was baffled. I was as exact as himself, and quicker. Mr. Crimsworth made inquiries as to how I lived, whether I got into debt. No, my accounts with my landlady were always straight. I had hired small lodgings, which I contrived to pay for out of a slender fund, the accumulated savings of my Eton pocket money. For as it had ever been abhorrent to my nature to ask pecuniary assistance, I had early acquired habits of self-denying economy, husbanding my monthly allowance with anxious care in order to obviate the danger of being forced in some moment of future exigency to beg additional aid. I remember many called me miser at the time, and I used to couple the reproach with this consolation: better to be misunderstood now than repulsed hereafter. At this day I had my reward. I had had it before when, on parting with my irritated uncles, one of them threw down on the table before me a £5 note, which I was able to leave there, saying that my traveling expenses were already provided for. So you see, he's a proud man. He doesn't want any help. He wants to do things on his own. Mr. Grimsworth employed Tim to find out whether my landlady had any complaint to make on the score of my morals. She answered that she believed I was a very religious man, and asked Tim in her turn if he thought I had any intention of going into the church some day. For, she said, she had had young curates to lodge in her house who were nothing equal to me for steadiness and quietness. Tim was a religious man himself. Indeed, he was a joint Methodist, which did not, be it understood, prevent him from being at the same time an ingrained rascal, and he came away much posed at hearing this account of my piety. Having imparted it to Mr. Crimsworth, that gentleman, who himself frequented no place of worship, in, and owed no god but Mammon, turned the information into a weapon of attack against the equality of my temper. He commenced a series of covert sneers, of which I did not at first perceive the drift, till my landlady happened to relate the conversation she had had with Mr. Steighton. This enlightened me. Afterwards I came to the counting-house prepared, and managed to receive the mill owner's blasphemous sarcasms when next levelled at me on a buckler of impenetrable indifference. Ere long he tired of wasting his ammunition on a statue, but he did not throw away the shafts. He only kept them quiet in his quiver. So they're not making life easy for him. Edward asked his first clerk, Timothy, to keep an eye out on William and to try to find fault with him, because he should be doing something wrong. And when he shows to be such a good, moral, and efficient person, they're both baffled. Once during my clerkship, I had an invitation to Crimsworth Hall. It was on the occasion of a large party given in honor of the master's birthday. He had always been accustomed to invite his clerks on similar anniversaries, and could not well pass me over. I was, however, kept strictly in the background. Mrs. Crimsworth, elegantly dressed in satin and lace, blooming in youth and health, vouchsafed me no more notice than was expressed by a distant move. Crimsworth, of course, never spoke to me. I was introduced to none of the band of young ladies who, enveloped in silvery clouds of white gauze and muslin, sat in array against me on the opposite side of a long and large room. In fact, I was fairly isolated, and could but contemplate the shining ones from afar, and when weary of such a dazzling scene, turned for a change to the consideration of the carpet pattern. Mr. Crimsworth, standing on the rug, his elbows supported by the marble mantelpiece, and about him a group of very pretty girls with whom he conversed gaily. Mr. Crimsworth, thus placed, glanced at me. I looked weary, solitary, kept down like some desolate tutor or governess. He was satisfied. So he's treating William really badly, and he's doing it on purpose, right? Some sort of jealousy or revenge. Um, and in this party to celebrate his birthday, he gives William, his brother, no attention, leaves him isolated. And he continues to describe this event. Dancing began. I should have liked well enough to be introduced to some pleasing and intelligent girl, and to have freedom and opportunity to show that I could both feel and communicate the pleasure of social intercourse. That I was not, in short, a block or a piece of furniture, but an acting, thinking, sentient man. That really hurts, right? It's so sad to make someone feel this way, especially your own brother. Many smiling faces and graceful figures glided past me, but the smiles were lavished on other eyes, the figures sustained by other hands than mine. I turned away tantalized, left the dancers, and wandered into the oak paneled dining room. No fiber of sympathy united me to any living thing in this house. I looked for and found my mother's picture. I took a wax taper from a stand and held it up. I gazed long, earnestly. My heart grew to the image. My mother, I perceived, had bequeathed to me much of her features and countenance, her forehead, her eyes, her complexion. No regular beauty pleases egotistical human beings so much as a softened and refined likeness of themselves. For this reason, fathers regard with complacency the lineaments of their daughters' faces, where frequently their own similitude is found flatteringly associated with softness of hue and delicacy of outline. I was just wondering how that picture, to me so interesting, would strike an impartial spectator when a voice close behind me pronounced the words, there's some sense in that face. Okay, before we read the dialogue, let's just say something. So he finds comfort in his mother's portrait. Um, he never got the chance to meet his mother, right? Um, although Edward had. So he tries to connect with her through the portrait, right? And then she hears this voice that interrupts him. I turned. At my elbow stood a tall man, young, though probably 5 or 6 years older than I. In other respects of an appearance, the opposite to commonplace. Though just now, as I am not disposed to paint his portrait in detail, the reader must be content with the silhouette I have just thrown off. And here the narrator, William himself, talks directly to the reader, right? Um, so the reader must be content with the silhouette that I give of this man now. I will not paint his whole portrait in detail at this point of the narrative. It was all I myself saw of him for the moment. I did not investigate the color of his eyebrows, nor of his eyes either. I saw his stature and the outline of his shape. I saw too his fastidious-looking retroussé nose. These observations, few in number and general in character, the last excepted, sufficed, for they enabled me to recognize him. "Good evening, Mr. Hunsden," muttered I with a bow, and then, like a shy noodle as I was, I began moving away. And why? Simply because Mr. Hunsden was a manufacturer and a mill owner, and I was only a clerk, and my instinct propelled me from my superior. So, see how Edward's discourse is getting into his mind? He's beginning to think of himself as indeed inferior, as not even able to have a conversation with this man because he was a manufacturer and mill owner, while he was simply a clerk. See? Well, we see that kind of psychological abuse in Jane Eyre as well. And that's something we'll talk about in the course. And they begin to almost, in this case, almost believe it. In Jane Eyre, she comes to believe it, even if it's not true. How terrible that is to do that kind of psychological abuse to another human being. All right. I had frequently seen Hunsden in Big Ben Close, where he came almost weekly to transact business with Mr. Crimsworth, but I had never spoken to him, nor he to me, and I owed him a sort of involuntary grudge, because he had more than once been the tacit witness of insults offered by Edward to me. I had the conviction that he could only regard me as a poor-spirited slave, wherefore I now went about to shun his presence and eschew his conversation. "Where are you going?" asked he as I edged off sideways. I had already noticed that Mr. Hunsden indulged in abrupt forms of speech, and I perversely said to myself, "He thinks he may speak as he likes to a poor clerk, but my mood is not perhaps so supple as he deems it, and his rough freedom pleases me not at all." I made some slight reply, rather indifferent than courteous, and continued to move away. He coolly planted himself in my path. "Stay here a while," said he. "It is so hot in the dancing room. Besides, you don't dance. You have not had a partner tonight." He was right, and as he spoke, neither his look, tone, nor manner displeased me. My amour-propre was propitiated. He had not addressed me out of a condescension, but because, having repaired to the cool dining room for refreshment, he now wanted someone to talk to, by way of temporary amusement. I hate to be condescended to, but I like well enough to oblige, so I stayed. "That is a good picture," he continued, recurring to the portrait of his mom. "Do you consider the face pretty?" I asked. "Pretty? No. How can it be pretty with sunk eyes and hollow cheeks? But it is peculiar. It seems to think. You could have a talk with that woman, if she were alive, on other subjects than dress, visiting, and compliments." I agreed with him, but did not say so. And now, remember, he talked about Mrs. Crimsworth the last time, that he was so disappointed at how silly the conversation was. But his mother, although she was not pretty in the, let's say, standard way, she had a peculiar face, one that seemed to think, and that is what calls William's attention. So something that connects himself to his mom, this intellectual beauty, let's say. He went on. "Not that I admire a head of that sort. It wants character and force. There's too much of the sensitive," so he articulated it, curling his lip at the same time, "in that mouth. Besides, there is aristocrat written on the brow and defined in the figure. I hate your aristocrats." "You think then, Mr. Hunsden, that patrician descent may be read in a distinctive cast of form and features?" "Patrician descent be hanged." So just parenthesis, Mr. Hunsden is a man from trade. He's successful, he's wealthy, but he's not an aristocrat, right? So there is this kind of strife between the old aristocracy, the landowners, and the nouveau riche, the new rich, were not born wealthy, but became wealthy because of trade. Patrician descent be hanged. Who doubts that your lordlings may have their distinctive cast of form and features as much as we, shire tradesmen, have ours? But which is the best? Not theirs, assuredly. As to their women, it is a little different. They cultivate beauty from childhood upwards, and may by care and training attain to a certain degree of excellence. In that point, just like the original odalisques, yet even this superiority is doubtful. Compare the figure in that frame with Mrs. Edward Crimsworth. Which is the finer animal? I replied quietly, "Compare yourself and Mr. Edward Crimsworth, Mr. Hunsden." "Oh, Crimsworth is better filled up than I am. I know besides he has a straight nose, arched eyebrows, and all that. But these advantages, if they are advantages, he did not inherit from his mother, the patrician, but from his father, old Crimsworth, who, my father says, was as veritable a shire blue dyer as ever put indigo in a vat, yet without the handsomest man in the three ridings. It is you, William, who are the aristocrat of your family, and you are not as fine a fellow as your plebeian brother by long chalk." There was something in Mr. Hunsden's point-blank mode of speech which rather pleased me than otherwise, because it set me at my ease. I continued the conversation with a degree of interest. "How do you happen to know that I am Mr. Crimsworth's brother? I thought you and everybody else looked upon me only in the light of a poor clerk." "Well, and so we do. And what are you but a poor clerk? You do Crimsworth's work, and he gives you wages. Shabby wages they are, too." I was silent. Hunsden's language now bordered on the impertinent. Still, his manner did not offend me in the least. It only piqued my curiosity. I wanted him to go on, which he did in a little while. This world is an absurd one, said he. Why so, Mr. Hunsden? I wonder you should ask. You are yourself a strong proof of the absurdity I allude to. I was determined he should explain himself of his own accord without my pressing him to do so, so I resumed my silence. Is it your intention to become a tradesman? He inquired presently. It was my serious intention 3 months ago. The more fool of you. You look like a tradesman. What a practical business-like face you have. And he's being sarcastic here, of course. My face is as the Lord made it, Mr. Hunsden. The Lord never made either your face or head for X. That's it, silly. What good can your bumps of ideality, comparison, self-esteem, conscientiousness do you here? But if you like Big Ben clothes, stay here. It's your own affair, not mine. Perhaps I have no choice. Well, I care not about it. It will make little difference to me what you do or where you go. But I'm cool now. I want to dance again. And I see such a fine girl sitting in the corner of the sofa there by her mamma. See if I don't get her for a partner in a jiffy. There's Waddy, Sam Waddy making up to her. Won't I cut him out? And Mr. Hunsden strode away. I watched him through the open folding doors. He outstripped Waddy, applied for the hand of the fine girl, and led her off triumphant. She was a tall, well-made, full-formed, dashingly dressed young woman, much in the style of Mrs. E. Crimsworth. Hunsden whirled her through the waltz with spirit. He kept at her side during the remainder of the evening, and I read in her animated and gratified countenance that he succeeded in making himself perfectly agreeable. The mamma, too, a stout person in a turban, Mrs. Lupton by name, looked well pleased. Prophetic visions probably flattered her inward eye. The Hunstons were of an old stamp, and scornful as York, such was my late interlocutor's name, professed to be of the advantages of birth, in his secret heart he well knew and fully appreciated the distinction his ancient, if not high lineage, conferred on him in a mushroom place like X, concerning whose inhabitants it was proverbially said that no one in 1,000 knew his own grandfather. Moreover, the Hunstons, once rich, were still independent, and report affirmed that York bade fair, by his success in business, to restore to pristine prosperity the partially decayed fortunes of his house. These circumstances considered, Mrs. Lupton's broad face might well wear a smile of complacency as she contemplated the heir of Hunsden Wood occupied in paying assiduous court to her darling Sarah Martha. I, however, whose observations being less anxious were likely to be more accurate, soon saw that the grounds for maternal self-congratulation were slight indeed. The gentleman appeared to me much more desirous of making than susceptible of receiving any impression. I know not what it was in Mr. Hunsden that, as I watched him, I had nothing better to do, suggested to me, every now and then, the idea of a foreigner. In form and features he might be pronounced English, though even there one caught a dash of something Gaelic. But he had no English shyness. He had learned somewhere, somehow, the art of setting himself quite at his ease, and of allowing no insular timidity to intervene as a barrier between him and his convenience or pleasure. Refinement he did not affect, yet vulgar he could not be called. He was not odd, no quiz, yet he resembled no one else I had ever seen before. His general bearing intimated complete sovereign satisfaction with himself, yet at times an undescribable shade passed like an eclipse over his countenance, and seemed to me like the sign of a sudden and strong inward doubt of himself. His words and actions an energetic discontent at his life or his social position, his future prospects or his mental attainments. I know not which. Perhaps, after all, it might only be a bilious caprice. And that is the end of chapter 3. So, William has spent, it's been, I think, 3 months since he started working for his brother. He's not happy. He's being very ill treated by his brother and by the other employees. People, especially his brother, wanted to find fault with him, but there's nothing wrong with him. So that makes his brother even angrier, if that makes any sense. And there are this celebration of Edward's birthday at the main residence, and he's completely isolated, feeling very low. And he comes across this man, Mr. Hunston, who talks to him in a very direct way, and gets him thinking, right, about what he's doing, where he is, and plants a little seed, let's say, in his mind. So let's continue with chapter 4, the last chapter we'll read for today. Let's see how his life in X, the name of the city, gets on. All right, chapter 4. No man likes to acknowledge that he has made a mistake in the choice of his profession, and every man worthy of the name will row long against wind and tide before he allows himself to cry out, "I am baffled," and submits to be floated passively back to land. From the first week of my residence in X, I felt my occupation irksome. The thing itself, the work of copying and translating business letters, was a dry and tedious task enough. But had that been all, I should long have borne with the nuisance. I am not of an impatient nature, and influenced by the double desire of getting my living and justifying to myself and others the resolution I had taken to become a tradesman, I should have endured in silence the rust and cramp of my best faculties. The rust and cramp of his best faculties, his mind, right? He's not using his mind, his intellect. He's just doing mechanic work, right? Translating business letters. I should not have whispered, even inwardly, that I longed for liberty. I should have pent in every sigh by which my heart might have ventured to intimate its distress under the closeness, smoke, monotony, and joyless tumult of Big Van Close, and its panting desire for freer and fresher scenes. Again, look at the vocabulary, the closeness. So it's claustrophobic, this place. Closeness, smoke, monotony, joyless, tumult. And deep inside, he wants freedom. He wants freer and fresher scenes. But he was a proud man. If the task itself, even mechanic as it was, not challenging his intellect, if that was all, he would have continued and be proud of the way he was making his living. But that was not all. I should have set up the image of duty with a capital D, the fetish of perseverance with a capital P, in my small bedroom at Mrs. King's lodgings, and they too should have been my household gods, from which my darling, my cherished in secret, imagination with a capital I, the tender and the mighty, should never, either by softness or strength, have severed me. But this was not all. The antipathy which had sprung up between myself and my employer, striking deeper root and spreading denser shade daily, excluded me from every glimpse of the sunshine of life. And I began to feel like a plant growing in humid darkness out of the slimy walls of a well. I like this image as well. Again, a very disturbing image. So he's being forced to think very low of himself, to putting his imagination and intellect to rust, and being treated very badly, the antipathy surrounding him, especially between him and his brother. And he begins to feel like a plant growing in humid darkness out of the slimy walls of a well. Terrible place, terrible condition, right? Antipathy is the only word which can express the feeling Edward Crimsworth had for me, a feeling in a great measure involuntary, and which was liable to be excited by every, the most trifling movement, look, or word of mine. My southern accent annoyed him. The degree of my education evinced in my language irritated him. My punctuality, industry, and accuracy fixed his dislike, and gave it the high flavor and poignant relish of envy. He feared that I too should one day make a successful tradesman. That's the root of the thing. Edward is jealous of William. He doesn't admit it, but perhaps he's jealous of the education that um, William was allowed to have, even though it was paid by the uncles that had abandoned their mother. And he wants to feel superior to William in any way. So he everything that William does, even positive things, annoys him, irritates him, fixes his dislike, and gives it the high flavor and poignant relish of envy. So terrible man. Had I been in anything inferior to him, he would not have hated me so thoroughly. You see, but I knew all that he knew, and what was worse, he suspected that I kept the padlock of silence on mental wealth in which he was no sharer. If he could have once placed me in a ridiculous or mortifying position, he would have forgiven me much. But I was guarded by three faculties: caution, tact, observation. And prowling and prying as was Edward's malignity, it could never baffle the lynx eyes of these, my natural sentinels. Day by day did his malice watch my tact, hoping it would sleep, and prepared to steal snake-like on its slumber, but tact, if it be genuine, never sleeps. I see a comment here by Sofiani. We all identify with William's character because many of us have faced similar situations. Yes, it's true what they say. What doesn't kill you doesn't make you stranger, it makes you stronger. Yes, it's a tough lesson for William, but I'm sure he will get out of this experience much stronger, with thicker skin, right? He's developing a thicker skin. I had received my first quarter's wages and was returning to my lodgings, possessed heart and soul with the pleasant feeling that the master who had paid me grudged every penny of that hard-earned pittance. I had long ceased to regard Mr. Crimsworth as my brother. He was a hard, grinding master. You see, the relationship has changed. I mean, stayed the same, but his expectations changed. He wished to be an inexorable tyrant, that was all. Thoughts, not varied but strong, occupied my mind. Two voices spoke within me. Again and again they uttered the same monotonous phrases. One said, "William, your life is intolerable." The other, "What can you do to alter it?" I walked fast, for it was a cold, frosty night in January. So I approached my lodgings. I turned from a general view of my affairs to the particular speculation as to whether my fire would be out. Looking towards the window of my sitting room, I saw no cheering red gleam. And this is, I would say, literally as well as metaphorically. So he looks and he sees no gleam, no red gleam, meaning that there is no fire in his lodgings, meaning it's cold, uncomfortable, not cozy. And metaphorically, that's how his life is. There's no fire in his life. He feels cold. He feels dead, right? "That slut of a servant has neglected it as usual," said I, "and I shall see nothing but pale ashes if I go in. It is a fine starlight night. I will walk a little farther." He still has this romantic imagination, so he pays attention to the starlight night and he decides to go for a walk. It was a fine night, and the streets were dry and even clean for X. There was a crescent curve of moonlight to be seen by the parish church tower, and hundreds of stars shone keenly bright in all quarters of the sky. Unconsciously, I steered my course towards the country. I had got into Grove Street and began to feel the pleasure of seeing dim trees at the extremity round a suburban house, when a person, leaning over the iron gate of one of the small gardens which front the neat dwelling houses in the street, addressed me as I was hurrying with quick stride past. "What the deuce is the hurry? Just so must Lot have left Sodom when he expected fire to pour down upon it out of burning breast clouds. I stopped short and looked towards the speaker. I smelt the fragrance and saw the red spark of a cigar, the dusk outline of a man too bent towards me over the wicket. You see, I am meditating in the field at eventide, continued this shade. God knows it's cool work, especially as instead of Rebecca on a camel's hump with bracelets on her arms and a ring in her nose, fate sends me only a counting house clerk in a grey tweed wrapper. The voice was familiar to me. Its second utterance enabled me to seize the speaker's identity. Mr. Hunsden, good evening. Good evening indeed. Yes, but you would have passed me without recognition if I had not been so civil as to speak first. I did not know you. A famous excuse. You ought to have known me. I knew you, though you were going ahead like a steam engine. Are the police after you? It wouldn't be worth their while. I'm not of consequence enough to attract them. Alas, poor shepherd, alack and well a day. What a theme for regret, and how down in the mouth you must be, judging from the sound of your voice. But since you're not running from the police, from whom are you running? The devil. On the contrary, I am going post to him, to the devil, and he probably means, well, his brother, or in general, life as hell, right? That is well, you're just in luck. This is Tuesday evening. There are scores of market gigs and carts returning to Dinford tonight, and he, the devil, or some of his, have a seat in all regularly. So if you'll step in and sit half an hour in my bachelor's parlor, you may catch him as he passes without much trouble. I think, though, you'd better let him alone tonight. He'll have so many customers to serve. Tuesday is his busy day in Axe and Dinford. Come in at all events. He swung the wicket open as he spoke. Do you really wish me to go in? I asked. As you please. I'm alone. Your company for an hour or two would be agreeable to me. But if you don't choose to favor me so far, I'll not press the point. I hate to bore anyone. It suited me to accept the invitation as it suited Hunsden to give it. I passed through the gate and followed him to the front door, which he opened. Thence we traversed a passage and entered his parlor. The door being shut, he pointed me to an armchair by the hearth. I sat down and glanced round me. It was a comfortable room, at once snug and handsome. The bright grate was filled with a genuine Shire fire, red, clear, and generous. No penurious south of England embers heaped in the corner of a grate. Now you see that Hunsden's home is the complete opposite of William's lodgings, right? William's lodging was cold, dark, barren, and this place is comfortable, snug, handsome, with genuine, generous fire. On the table, a shaded lamp diffused around soft, pleasant, and equal light. Look at the words, soft, pleasant, equal. You see later luxurious, neatness, all these positive words that create this very positive and cozy atmosphere. Something that he wishes he could have, right? The furniture was almost luxurious for a young bachelor, comprising a couch and two very easy chairs. Bookshelves filled the recesses on each side of the mantelpiece. They were well furnished and arranged with perfect order. The neatness of the room suited my taste. I hate irregular and slovenly habits. From what I saw, I concluded that Hunsden's ideas on that point corresponded with my own. While he removed from the center table to the sideboard a few pamphlets and periodicals, I ran my eye along the shelves of the bookcase nearest me. French and German works predominated. The old French dramatists, sundry modern authors, Thiers, Villemin, Paul de Kock, George Sand, Eugene Sue. In German, Goethe, Schiller, Zocke, Jean-Paul Richter. In English, there were works on political economy. I examined no further, for Mr. Hunsden himself recalled my attention. You know, you get to know someone by looking at their bookcases, right? So this is what William does here, and he's kind of probably jealous that this man has access to all this knowledge, something that would really, really make him happy. You shall have something, said he, for you ought to feel disposed for refreshment after walking nobody knows how far on such a Canadian night as this. But it shall not be brandy and water, and it shall not be a bottle of port, nor ditto of sherry. I keep no such poison. I have rain wine for my own drinking, and you may choose between that and coffee. Here again Hunsden suited me. If there was one generally received practice I abhorred more than another, it was the habitual imbibing of spirits and strong wines. I had, however, no fancy for his acid German nectar, but I liked coffee, so I responded, "Give me some coffee, Mr. Hunsden." I perceived my answer pleased him. He had doubtless expected to see a chilling effect produced by his steady announcement that he would give me neither wine nor spirits. He just shot one searching glance at my face to ascertain whether my cordiality was genuine or a mere feint of politeness. I smiled because I quite understood him, and while I honored his conscientious firmness, I was amused at his mistrust. He seemed satisfied, rang the bell, and ordered coffee, which was presently brought. For himself, a bunch of grapes and half a pint of something sour sufficed. My coffee was excellent, I told him so, and expressed the shuddering pity with which his anchorite fare inspired me. Oh, I see a comment here by Michelle. She writes, your bookcase is often as good as a mirror. Yes, I love looking at other people's bookcases when I visit them in their home, if they allow it, of course. It's such an interesting way to get to know the person by what they read, what interests they have, right? It's indeed as good as a mirror. So he chose coffee and he's having coffee at Mr. Hunsden's house. Um, well, and he said that the coffee was excellent. He did not answer, and I scarcely think heard my remark. At that moment, one of those momentary eclipses I before alluded to had come over his face, extinguishing his smile and replacing by an abstracted and alienated look the customary shrewd, bantering glance of his eye. So Mr. Hunsden looks like a very outspoken, confident man, but there are these moments, these eclipses, as William calls it, in which doubt um, shades his countenance. And this was one of these moments. So there's definitely more to Mr. Hunsden than we know so far. Um, I employed the interval of silence in a rapid scrutiny of his physiognomy. I had never observed him closely before, and as my sight is very short, I had gathered only a vague general idea of his appearance. I was surprised now on examination to perceive how small and even feminine were his lineaments. His tall figure, long and dark locks, his voice and general bearing had impressed me with the notion of something powerful and massive. Not at all. My own features were cast in a harsher and squarer mold than his. I discerned that there would be contrasts between his inward and outward man. Contentions, too, for I suspected his soul had more of will and ambition than his body had of fiber and muscle. Perhaps in these incompatibilities of the psyche with the morale lay the secret of that fitful gloom. He would but could not, and the athletic mind scowled scorn on its more fragile companion. As to his good looks, I should have liked to have a woman's opinion on that subject. It seemed to me that his face might produce the same effect on a lady that a very piquant and interesting, though scarcely pretty, female face would on a man. I have mentioned his dark locks. They were brushed sideways above a white and sufficiently expansive forehead. His cheek had a rather hectic freshness. His features might have done well on canvas, but indifferently in marble. They were plastic. Character had set a stamp upon each. Expression recast them at her pleasure. And strange metamorphoses she wrought, giving him now the mien of a morose bull, and anon that of an arch and mischievous girl. More frequently, the two semblances were blent, and a queer composite countenance they made. Like there's something fighting there on his body and soul, right? Starting from his silent fit, he began, William, what a fool you are to live in those dismal lodgings of Mrs. King's when you might take rooms here in Grove Street and have a garden like me. I should be too far from the mill. What of that? It would do you good to walk there and back 2 or 3 times a day. Besides, are you such a fossil that you never wish to see a flower or a green leaf? I am no fossil. What are you then? You sit at that desk in Crimsworth's counting house day by day and week by week, scraping with a pen and paper, just like an automaton. You never get up, you never say you're tired, you never ask for a holiday, you never take change or relaxation. You give way to no excess of an evening. You neither keep wild company nor indulge in strong drink. So that's his life. Pretty boring, right? Do you, Mr. Hunsden? Don't think to pose me with short questions. Your case and mine are diametrically different, and it is nonsense attempting to draw a parallel. I say that when a man endures patiently what ought to be unendurable, he is a fossil. And that's exactly what William is becoming, a fossil. If he stays there, he will be petrified forever. Whence do you acquire the knowledge of my patience? Why, man, do you suppose you are a mystery? The other night you seemed surprised at my knowing to what family you belonged. Now you find subject for wonderment in my calling you patient. What do you think I do with my eyes and ears? I've been in your counting house more than once when Crimsworth has treated you like a dog. Called for a book, for instance, and when you gave him the wrong one, or what he chose to consider the wrong one, flung it back almost in your face. Desired you to shut or open the door as if you had been his flunky, to say nothing of your position at the party about a month ago, where you had neither place nor partner, but hovered about like a poor shabby hanger-on, and how patient you were under each and all of these circumstances. Well, Mr. Hunsden, what then? I can hardly tell you what then. The conclusion to be drawn as to your character depends upon the nature of the motives which guide your conduct. If you're patient because you expect to make something eventually out of Crimsworth, notwithstanding his tyranny, or perhaps by means of it, you are what the world calls an interested and mercenary, but may be a very wise fellow. If you are patient because you think it a duty to meet insult with submission, you are an essential sap and in no shape the man for my money. If you're patient because your nature is phlegmatic, flat, inexcitable, and that you cannot get up to the pitch of resistance, why God made you to be crushed, and lie down by all means and lie flat, and let Juggernaut ride well over you. Mr. Hunsden's eloquence was not, it will be perceived, of the smooth and oily order. As he spoke, he pleased me ill. I seemed to recognize in him one of those characters who, sensitive enough themselves, are selfishly relentless towards the sensitiveness of others. Moreover, though he was neither like Crimsworth nor Lord Tyndale, yet he was acrid, and I suspected overbearing in his way. There was a tone of despotism in the urgency of the very reproaches by which he aimed at goading the oppressed into rebellion against the oppressor. Looking at him still more fixedly than I had yet done, I saw written in his eye and mien a resolution to arrogate to himself a freedom so unlimited that it might often trench on the just liberty of his neighbors. I rapidly ran over these thoughts, and then I laughed a low and involuntary laugh, moved thereto by a slight inward revelation of the inconsistency of men. It was as I thought. Hunsden had expected me to take with calm his incorrect and offensive surmises, his bitter and haughty taunts, and himself was chafed by a laugh scarce louder than a whisper. His brow darkened, and his thin nostril dilated a little. Yes, he began, I told you that you were an aristocrat, and who but an aristocrat would laugh such a laugh as that, and look such a look? A laugh frigidly jeering, a look lazily mutinous, gentlemanlike irony, patrician resentment. What a nobleman you would have made, William Crimsworth. You are cut out for one. Pity fortune has balked nature. Look at the features, figure, even to the hands. Distinction all over. Ugly distinction. Now, if you'd only an estate and a mansion and a park and a title, how you could play the exclusive, maintain the rights of your class, train your tenantry in habits of respect to the peerage, oppose at every step the advancing power of the people, support a rotten order, and be ready for its sake to wade knee deep in Charles' blood. As it is, you have no power. You can do nothing. You are wrecked and stranded on the shores of commerce, forced into collision with practical men, with whom you cannot cope, for you'll never be a tradesman. And that's harsh what he says, right? The first part of Hunsden's speech moved me not at all. Or if it did, it was only to wonder at the perversion into which prejudice had twisted his judgment of my character. The concluding sentence, however, not only moved, but shook me. The blow it gave me was a severe one, because truth, with a capital T, wielded the weapon. If I smiled now, it was only in disdain of myself. It pains him to agree with Mr. Hunsden, but yes, the truth, with a capital T, um, sinks. You'll never be a tradesman. Hunsden saw his advantage. He followed it up. You make nothing by trade, continued he, nothing more than the crust of dry bread and the draught of fair water on which you now live. Your only chance of getting a competency lies in marrying a rich widow or running away with an heiress. I leave such shifts to be put in practice by those who devise them, said I, rising. And even that is hopeless, he went on coolly. What widow would have you? Much less what heiress? You are not bold and venturesome enough for the one, nor handsome and fascinating enough for the other. You think perhaps you look intelligent and polished, carry your intellect and refinement to market, and tell me in a private note what price is bid for them. Mr. Hunsden had taken his tone for the night. The string he struck was out of tune. He would finger no other. Averse to discord, of which I had enough every day and all day long, I concluded at last that silence and solitude were preferable to jarring converse. I bade him good night. What, are you going, lad? Well, good night, you'll find the door. And he sat still in front of the fire while I left the room and the house. I had got a good way on my return to my lodgings before I found out that I was walking very fast and breathing very hard, and that my nails were almost stuck into the palms of my clenched hands, and that my teeth were set fast on making this discovery. I relaxed both my pace, fists, and jaws, but I could not so soon cause the regrets rushing rapidly through my mind to slacken their tide. Why did I make myself a tradesman? Why did I enter Hunsden's house this evening? Why, at dawn tomorrow, must I repair to Crimsworth's mill? All that night did I ask myself these questions, and all that night fiercely demanded of my soul an answer. I got no sleep. My head burned, my feet froze. At last the factory bells rang, and I sprang from my bed with other slaves. And that's a very highly charged word, slave, right? So he's not happy. He needs to find true purpose in his life, and that purpose is not being a tradesman, he has come to realize. So we'll see what he's going to do with his life next time when we read together chapters 5, 6, and 7. So I hope you enjoyed today's session. I hope to see you again live here next week on Thursday. What day is that? Next Thursday is the 22nd of February, when we'll continue the guided reading sessions. And I also hope to see you in our online course, Exploring Jane Eyre, a journey into Victorian literature. I hope to see you there so we can discuss this masterpiece by Charlotte Brontë. So have a wonderful day. I see here some comments. Thanks for the lecture, Dr. Fernanda. That I make it live today. I'm happy. I believe I am also happy that you're here live. Thank you for the interaction, for engaging in this class. And I'll see you next time.